Hello viewers, today I am going to speak to you about a very important part of our body, the central nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord and influences much of our behavior. So, today I will take you on a journey through this important, very complex organ known as the brain and also the spinal cord. If you look at yourself, within your body, your head and the spinal cord lies the essence of your identity, and this is the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are made up of more than 100 billion nerve cells. These nerve cells are spread throughout the body and they are connected in many complex and myriad ways, and they bring in all the information which we get from our sense organs to the master organ, which is the brain. And it is here that all this information is received, analyzed, and then the message is spread to the different parts of the body through the nerve cells, the neurons, in an electrochemical process. So, the brain and the spinal cord are connected to all other parts of the body and are instrumental in sending the messages after having analyzed them and interpreted them to the different parts of the body. In doing so, they regulate and modulate all our behaviors, whether it is our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, our moods, or even our movement. And so, today we will be looking at these two structures which together are really very important in our life. The brain is connected to the spinal cord, which runs down from your neck to the base of the body. Towards the hip area. Now, looking at the spinal cord, it is a complex cable of nerves that connects the brain to the rest of the body, and it has two main functions. Some of the reflex actions are a result of the action of the spinal cord, and also the various nerves which exist in the spinal cord are instrumental in carrying the messages to and from the brain. So, these are the two main functions of the spinal cord, the reflex actions, some of the reflex actions, and the carrying of the messages to and from the brain. So, this is a very vast communication system which is monitored by these two structures. Now, coming to the brain of course is the most complex organ in your body. It is a very, very important structure which controls almost all of our behavior. If you look at it, it is a jelly like mass, it weighs about 1.4 kg and contains, though it weighs that much, it contains a staggering amount of nerve cells which make the communication possible, which regulates and monitors our behavior. I will tell you about some of the facts about the brain, and then we will go on to look at the structure of the brain, the different parts of the brain, and then we will see how in the brain, in the structures of the brain are areas which are responsible for the different functions of the brain. So, we will be going through this journey today, and I would like to tell you a few things about the brain. The brain consists, when you think of the brain, most people think that they call it the grey matter. But it is only 40% of the brain which is grey matter, which is actually the cell body of brain, and the white matter is 60% of the brain, which is the axons and the dendrites which leave the cell body and through which the communication is carried out throughout the body. So, 40% is grey matter and 60% is white matter. And though the brain, which is about 1.4 kg, is about 2% of the total body weight, but it contains, it's a very greedy organ. It takes in 20% of the oxygen supply of the brain and gets 20% of the blood flow which is there throughout the body. The blood vessels supply the brain with oxygen and nutrients and carry away the wastes. If these brain cells do not receive oxygen for more than 3 to 5 minutes, the brain cells begin to die. Modern technology has made it very easy for us to understand how the brain works. Then we had 1 or 2 methods by which we could study the brain, and these were invasive methods. So, by ablations and lesions, it was possible for people who are studying the brain to identify which areas are carrying out which functions. Another invasive method which was used is the electrical stimulation of the brain. In this, certain parts of the brain are stimulated with a very low voltage shock, and this stimulates the certain parts of the brain and tells us about the different functions of the brain. But today, we do not only rely on these methods, we have many modern methods which are at the cutting edge of research. The most common method of measuring the brain waves, which measures the brain waves, and it is the electroencephalogram. Apart from the EEG, which is very common and you will find them in most hospitals, we have the CAT scan. The CAT is the computerized axial tomography. PET stands for positron emission tomography. Okay. And then of course, we have the MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging. It images the brain, and a more modern method of this is known as the functional MRI, which makes it possible for us to see which parts of the brain are active in different kinds of behavior. And a very new method is known as the SQUID, which is a very complex method, but is being used in some of the areas. How our brain develops. The brain starts developing right in the prenatal period. It starts from a tubular structure and grows into the large brain which we know of, which has all the different parts. Now, in the womb, in the prenatal period, genes are largely responsible for determining how the brain is growing. The brain does not stop growing as soon as you are born. It continues to grow rapidly for the first 3 years of your life, and then of course, it goes into a period of consolidation, and the brain usually has periods of bursts of growth followed by a period of consolidation. Now, what happens in the consolidation period is that some pruning is carried out to remove the excess brain cells, and then again you may have a rapid burst of growth. Now, this rapid bursts are usually in the first 3 years of life, and the final burst is in the years of young adulthood. But now we know through new research that the brain continues to develop new brain cells, and this process is throughout our lives, and this process is known as neurogenesis. How your brain ages is also determined partly by your genes, but largely by your lifestyle. Now, let us look at the brain structure. The brain has many structures embedded within its within the skull, in the brain, and the brain is located inside your skull, and the skull is a very hard structure, and it protects the brain from not only from any movement or jerks or hits or being crushed, and also from diseases. inside below these this skull are 3 membranes known as meninges. Is a space which is filled with fluid, which not only keeps the brain buoyant, okay, but it also protects it from external agents. Now, another way in which the brain is protected is known as the blood-brain barrier. This barrier prevents most of the molecules coming into the central nervous system, but there are certain drugs which influence our brain and which are able to cross this blood-brain barrier. Now, we will look at the structure of the brain. We can look at the brain as a whole, and the larger components of the brain can be broken down into the smaller parts till we go right down to the nuts and bolts, which is the neuron. If you look at the structure of the human brain, it is broadly divided into 3 areas: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Each of these areas consists of different structures, and we will be looking at them in detail. Looking at the hindbrain, which is the lower part of the brain, we have 3 important structures: the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla. The pons is involved in consciousness. The cerebellum is a very important structure and resembles a cauliflower, and the medulla is like a stem and is like relays information and is also involved in certain other functions of the brain. Sitting on top of the hindbrain is the midbrain, which consists of the reticular formation. This formation, which has many small structures, is implicated in speech and in auditory and visual processing. The forebrain. The forebrain consists of many structures. The main structures in the forebrain are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, the basal ganglia, and the cerebral cortex. The thalamus is the main structure which communicates between the rest of the body and sends all the information to the higher centers in the brain. Below the thalamus lies the hypothalamus. This structure has close connection with the pituitary gland and is very much involved in the running of the endocrine system. It controls temperature, hunger, and thirst. The limbic system also consists of many structures such as the hippocampus and the amygdala and several other smaller structures, and are said to be the seat of emotion. I will look at a little more in detail. The basal ganglia is involved in motor movement. The most important of the structures of the forebrain is the cortex. The cerebral cortex, as the name suggests, is like a covering, and it is the most recent addition to the human brain in terms of evolution, and that is why it is also known as the neocortex. When you look at the brain and you see the top of the brain, which is a convoluted structure, meaning it has several ups and downs, and what we call in technical terms, it has several fissures and valleys and ridges. These have different names, like the fissures, the sulci, and the gyri. The gyri are the valleys, peaks between the fissures. Now, the convoluted part of the brain is the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is a very important part of the brain, and this structure can be further divided into 4 lobes. The 4 lobes are the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. In between these 4 lobes are the various fissures and gyri and sulci. As a rule, generally if you see the lobes which are at the back of the brain of the cerebral cortex, which are the parietal and the temporal lobe, these are the ones which receive all the information from the various parts of the body through the sensory organs, and it is the other lobes which are in the front and especially the frontal lobe, which is involved in integrating, analyzing and carrying out the actions based on the information it receives from the different parts of the body. If you look broadly at the 4 lobes, first I will explain to you what are their main functions. The occipital lobe is the area of visual perception, and all the sensory information from the eyes are received in the occipital lobe, where it is processed and the actions are carried out, the responses. The temporal lobe is involved in mainly in memory. The parietal lobe is involved in visuomotor guidance, and it is the frontal lobe which has a large number of functions. It is the area of the brain which is involved in planning, decision making, troubleshooting, that is problem solving, involved when you are experiencing novel situations, dangerous situations, overcoming habitual responses and temptation. Though we try to say that these different functions are carried out by the different parts of the brain, it is not so simple. All of the parts of the brain are integrated when we are responding to something, but it is possible to assign certain functions to certain parts of the brain. Now, looking at the limbic system, it has many structures. The hippocampus, which is involved in spatial memory. Then we have another structure in the limbic system, which is the amygdala, and this is involved in fear reactions and in emotion, and this is supposed to be the seat of emotion. Whenever you are experiencing any particular emotion, the shortcut in the brain is it goes to the amygdala first, and then it reaches the other parts of the brain where further analysis is carried out. So, when you experience a gut feeling, it is what you are experiencing through the amygdala. Limbic system regulates all kinds of motivated behavior as well as emotional behavior, whether it is eating, drinking, anger, anxiety or any other kind of motivated behaviors. I also want to speak to you about certain other brain structures which are important. There is the anterior cingulate gyrus, which runs lengthwise through the deep parts of the frontal lobes, and this is the brain's main switching region, and it is often called the gear switcher. And when we have to move our behavior from one situation to another, it is this part of the brain which is activated, and what we say is that it is this part of the brain which allows us cognitive flexibility. That means flexibility in our thinking, in our actions and in what we do. The cerebellum is in the hindbrain, but it is a very important structure because it contains 50% of the brain's neurons, and these neurons are involved in motor coordination, posture and how we walk, and also they are involved in the processing speed, in how fast we can think. Now, if you look at the cerebral cortex, which covers the brain, it is made up of 2 hemispheres, and it is connected together by a band of fibers which is called the corpus callosum, and which allows communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. The two hemispheres are not identical mirror images, there is a slight asymmetry, and that is why it has given rise to the notion of the left brain and the right brain. Of course, I would like to mention here that the left part of the brain controls the right part of all the messages from the right part of our body go to the left side of the brain, and information from the left side of the body go to the right side of the brain. Now, this concept of left and right brain is still being researched, but many people believe that the left brain is the center for language functions and is supposed to be more creative and flexible, whereas the right brain is the seat for logic. And they also believe that the right brain is dominant over the left brain. Assigning of different functions to the left brain and the right brain is known as lateralization of brain function. Two areas in the brain are associated with language are Broca's and Wernicke's area, which are involved in language comprehension and other aspects of language, and this is located in the left part of the brain, which is involved in language, and the right part of the brain is more involved with emotions and creativity and spatial tasks. Though I said that different parts of the brain have different functions, I would again like to emphasize that for the convenience of dividing these functions, we can say that, but whenever we are carrying out any behavior, many parts of the brain are involved in a coordinated fashion to bring about our behavior. One of the most common problems is, which affects mostly old people, is known as Alzheimer's disease, in which it is a degenerative disease. As you grow older, the brain cells don't have the capacity to regenerate, and the first thing to be affected in Alzheimer's is the memory, which is later followed by other changes in the personality. Another disorder, many of the mental disorders in fact, such as schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorders, phobic disorders and sleep disorders are due to some biochemistry or problem or something wrong in the brain. Either it is levels of neurotransmitters or some damage to different parts of the brain which can cause these mental disorders. Attention deficit disorder, which affects young children, is also due to, one of the reasons for that is brain pathology, and also some of the learning disabilities such as dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, which occurs in children with normal intelligence, but because of some aspect of the brain pathology are not able to keep up with a normal teaching and learning process. This also is due to brain pathology. Then of course, we have stroke and traumatic brain injury. Stroke is when there is insufficient supply of oxygen to the brain, and traumatic brain injury is when you hit your head against something hard or you receive a jolt to the body. The brain which is inside the skull is well protected, but it is shaken up so much that some parts of the brain get damaged. So, these are some of the aspects of brain pathology. These are some of the common problems which we have with the brain.
How can we protect our brain and keep it healthy?
That's a very good question. It's very important to protect the brain, first of all to respect the brain and know how important it is for us. So, you need to protect it from several things. You need to protect it from physical stress, from emotional stress, from sleep deprivation and from toxic substances. And also there are some other things which you can do to keep your brain in optimal condition. One very important thing is eating right. You are what you eat, and therefore, it is important to eat the right kind of foods, and a balanced diet is essential. Physical exercise is something which really helps the brain, and opens up all the nerve cells and makes it more receptive. So, if you have an exam the next day, I would suggest you do some physical exercise which make you more receptive to take in the information. Listening to music, dancing, playing an instrument, or all these things help the brain to keep healthy. You should also know ways of soothing the brain. You can do that by meditation, by listening to your mind and body, biofeedback, and by laughing on a daily basis. Laughter is important to calm and soothe the brain, and there are several other ways in which you can help the brain to remain calm and not fall prey to stress. Keep the brain healthy by indulging in mental exercise apart from physical exercise. So, you can learn a new language, you can learn a new instrument, how to play a new instrument, you can find out about new things and do crosswords and do all these things which will keep your mind, brain active. I have now given you a fair idea of the brain and the spinal cord, which together make up the central nervous system, and no computer can equal the human brain. I hope you have understood now at least about how the brain functions, because a better understanding of the brain function will help us to lead a better life, will help us to know that we need to protect our brain, to respect our brain, and to not do anything which will harm the brain, because it is a very, very vital organ as far as human behavior is concerned.